Let's build the perfect beginner tank. Something that's easy to set up, comes with most of the gear you need, small enough to fit anywhere, and filled with easy to care for fish and coral. Okay, forgive the hyperbole because I know there's no such thing as a perfect beginner tank, but the one I'm about to show you is pretty dang good. For this build today, we will be using the Red Sea Max Nano. We already made a video on how to set that system up and you'll find the link below. Today, we're gonna start with the end goal. A mixed reef tank with easy to care for soft and LPS corals and maybe 1 or 2 hardy SPS corals as well. We're gonna only lightly stock it with fish because we don't wanna deal with a heavy bio load in this small 20-gallon tank. We want to build the aquascape in such a way that doesn't require any additional wave makers that will just clutter up the display tank. And because we're going to build it entirely in one day, we need to make sure the tank is insta-cycled. Now that we know our goal, let's get started with the rock and the sand. We went with our favorite Carib Sea special grade for this build. I would have really preferred some ocean direct sand because it comes pre-packed with a huge biome, but I already had some previously used, rinsed, and clean sand in my garage, so we just went with that. We don't need a very deep sand bed in this build, so I probably only used 5 to 10 pounds max of the special grade sand. As I'm trying to keep the bio load low, I want to be able to clean my sand bed so it doesn't become a detritus trap. I also know I don't really need the sand bed for any specific livestock other than snails and copepods, so less than 1 inch is going to be fine. But because there's a decent amount of flow coming from the included return pump, sugar fine and maybe even Fiji pink would be a little bit too fine and might blow around my tank. For the aquascape, I'm only trying to accomplish 2 things. Number 1, make it visually appealing, and number 2, provide some space to mount the corals. I'm not trying to create a specific home for fish like gobies, dartfish, or wrasses. Those types of fish would require a lot of hiding places to feel safe, but I don't want to clutter up my display tank with a lot of rock. What that means is I won't be able to add those fish to my tank because I won't be providing the habitat that they need. It's absolutely crucial that when you aquascape for your perfect beginner tank that you know its limitations. If you end up with a rather minimalistic aquascape like the one I built, you'll need to stick with fish that live in the water column. In a small tank like the Red Sea Max Nano, you can't have it all, so when you're building your aquascape, just think about what your end goal is going to be and then scape accordingly. For this tank, I wanted to go with that insta-coralline look that only human-made reef rock can provide, and I hadn't used Aquaforest reef rock in a long time. I only had to use a few pieces, and I secured them together with some super glue and coralline colored epoxy. I actually made this aquascape for another video a couple months ago, and I have a hard time even now finding the seams. I made sure to keep the aquascape pretty low down in the water column so there would be space near the top for placing coral. Less is more here because the goal isn't to stare at the aquascape itself, but to all of the coral that are attached to it. I always follow the rule of thirds when building my aquascapes and try to place the rock at the proper intersection so that it pops as much as possible. Since I'm going to be using coral from my frag system, I needed to make sure there was quite a bit of empty space up front so I could put a few corals directly on the sand bed. And since I don't want to add an additional wave maker, there needs to be adequate space around and through the center of the aquascape so there are no dead zones. After building the large piece on the left, which I think was a total of 3 pieces, I just placed 1 piece on the right, which I ended out swapping out later for a pre-made Zoa garden. The Red Sea Max bundle comes with a small gravity-fed auto top-off unit, but I found from previous use that it only lasts 2 to 3 days, and I just don't want to have to refill it that much. So instead, I'm going to fill a 5-gallon bucket halfway with RODI water, and then use a Reef Breeder's ATO to top off the evaporated water daily. I really like the Reef Breeder Prism ATOs, especially for smaller systems, and I'm actually currently using 1 in each of the tanks behind me. It's become standard for me to use Wi-Fi strips to control all of my gear. It makes turning everything on and off for water changes super easy and also makes programming dosing pumps simple as well. Rather than drill into the cabinet stand, I just use some large strips of Velcro. I also mounted the Red Sea Reef LED power supply and the Bayi temperature controller using Velcro as well. To heat my system, I'm using a Phoenix titanium heater, which is placed in the middle compartment of the rear filtration chamber and is set to 80 degrees. And then for added redundancy, I have the Bayi controller set to 78 degrees with a variance of plus or minus 0.5 degrees which means it will heat from 77.5 degrees to 78.5 degrees. I made sure to place the Bayite temperature probe in the compartment before the Phoenix titanium heater, that way all of the water is heated equally. For now, I'm not going to be using the included Red Sea protein skimmer as I'm expecting a small bio load for this tank. But that also allows me the space to put several bags of ceramic media which have been sitting in my Waterbox Frag system sump for months. This will help give me that insta-cycle I need to jumpstart this tank on day one. Well, it's time to get the tank wet, and I did something a little different this time around. I always use Tropic Marin Pro Reef salt, so that hasn't changed. But since I'm only using corals that are currently in my frag tank, I decided to fill up the perfect beginner tank with water directly from the frag system. That means that at least starting out, the water parameters across the two tanks will be exactly the same, which, according to my last water test, pegged the alkalinity at 8.6, my nitrate at 7.5, and my phosphate at 0.04. Really not that bad. My goal here is to reduce the stress for the fish, but especially the coral, as much as possible during the move. This is especially true for the corals since their lighting systems will be different, going from 2 aqua illumination hydras to 1 Red Sea Reef LED. But we'll talk about the lights in greater detail a little bit later in this video. Now is the stage when you need to cycle your tank. If you have access to pre-cycled media like I did, then you can just insta-cycle your tank. But if not, and if you're a beginner, how would you have access to that? You'll need to cycle your tank at this point. I actually added some Frit Turbo Start to this tank to give the already present beneficial bacteria an added boost. And if you've never used Turbo Start to cycle your tank, it is supposed to smell like rotten eggs, rotten milk, rotten cheese, really a melange of rotten dairy products. Moving on to corals, I have a pretty good collection going at this point, so there's a lot to choose from. This is not the best aquascape for maximizing coral placement as there's a bit too much vertical rock work, but we'll make do with what we created. I always try to make my life easy when placing corals, so I just stare at the options and I choose the one that jumps out to me first and makes the most sense. In this case, it was the zoas. A few months ago, I made a zoa garden video with some pretty worldwide coral specimen, and that rock is starting to fill in nicely. So rather than create a new rock with some of the frags I have, I'm just gonna go with the pre-made zoa garden that already looks nice. It's not totally filled in yet, but give it a couple months and it will be. I always like adding Fimbriophilia to my tank, but for the beginner build, I'm staying away from Euphilia. For whatever reason, my torch corals just don't do as well as my hammer corals, my frog spawn, and my octospawn corals. In fact, out of the 30 or so pieces I got from Worldwide Corals about 6 months ago, I'd say 6 or 7 of them died, and they were all torch corals. The torch corals I have left are in recovery mode, so I just want to leave them in place rather than stress them out with another move. For this build, I chose 2 thriving hammer corals and 1 frog spawn or octospawn. Honestly, I can't tell the difference between the two of them. Evidently, the octospawn has more tips on every tentacle, but they both just look awesome to me. I placed them lower down in the aquascape where the par would be a bit less, but also near the corner where it would get plenty of flow from the return pump. Next, I wanted some more height in the back of the tank, so I thought it'd be pretty cool to add a couple photosynthetic gorgonians that I got from Alyssa at Seahorse Savvy. I think they're called either lace or ribbon gorgonians, but regardless of the name, they give a good pop of color to the rear of the tank, add some height, and as an added bonus, come with some cool, very small symbiotic sea stars attached. It's really simple to keep these photosynthetic gorgonians in your tank. Just keep the phosphate levels low to avoid nuisance algae growth. Keep a fresh pack of carbon in your tank every week, and if any of the tips start to die, just clip them back. I needed something for the sand bed up near the front, and luckily I have a pretty nice collection of mushrooms. I'm a huge fan of these bright fluorescent orange mushrooms that a fellow hobbyist Cole gave to me. These are actually 2 of maybe 7 or 8 babies from a small piece he gave me several years ago. I just wanted a few different color mushrooms, but nothing that grew too fast and would take over the others. I took a risk and added 1 acropora that Cole also gave me, and I put it near the top of the tank so it would get as much par as possible, but it still might not be enough, so I'm gonna monitor its health and rehome if needed. Cole also gave gave me this green Montipora several months ago, and it's been thriving in my frag system with only about 100 to 120 par. So I figured it would also do well in this perfect beginner tank. It's a plating coral, so I put it on the left edge of my aquascape so that as it grows, it won't cast shadows for any coral beneath it. I trimmed as much of the aragonite frag disc off as I could, but unfortunately for now, you can still see it a little bit, but over time it will get covered over. I needed something else to fill out the top of the aquascape, so I went with one of my more filled out colonies of Blastomusus. It puffs out really well and will hide the frag disc when it's fully open. Normally I wouldn't place it that high in the aquascape for fear of too much par, but I actually tested the par level before and it's the perfect amount right on top. For now, that's it for corals, so it's time to add a couple of fish. I didn't have that many to choose from in my frag system, and I didn't want to go out and buy something new and have to do a lengthy quarantine process. Luckily, I have a couple of great fish. Right size, been with me for a couple years, and that are perfectly happy to live out their lives in the water column. The first is my rather large pajama cardinal fish, and the second is my biting clownfish. But that's it for fish. The thing about the Red Sea Max Nano system is it's only 20 gallons, and since I'm not using the included protein skimmer, the only mechanical filtration I currently have is one small filter sock. And since I don't want to have to do a huge water change every week, the less fish the better. But honestly, just those two fish combined with all the coral makes the tank look pretty good already. Just give the tank a couple more months to settle in and it will fill out nicely. The last bit of livestock I'm adding for today are 3 bottles of Algae Barn's Galaxy Pods. Since Ryan's Biome series, I add copepods to every brand new tank. They are an essential cleanup crew member that keeps diatoms at bay from day one. I did the exact same thing for the Caribbean garden tank and I never had an ugly phase. Galaxy Pods are a mix of 5 different copepod species, each of which has a different function in your tank. Some of them focus entirely on film, algae, and diatoms, while others focus on detritus and bits of food left over in the rockwork and sandbed. I turned off the lights and the return pump for 30 minutes to give the copepods a chance to settle in, and I also added a small amount of ocean magic live phytoplankton for them to eat. The last step for setting it all up is to program the lights. Using the Red Sea Reef Beat app, there are several presets to choose from based on Kelvin. My primary goal was to match the spectrum, schedule, and par as close as possible to my Waterbox frag system since that's where all the corals came from. The 12K schedule accomplished that well for me. I've said it before, but I'm just not a huge fan of overly blue tanks. I prefer some blue to make the fluorescence of the corals pop, but I like that balanced out with plenty of white light to make everything pleasing. With the Reef LEDs, you can control the blue and the white spectrum separately, and the 12K preset is equal amounts of both. With the spectrum now matched as closely as possible, I now adjusted the schedule to mimic all of my other tanks. 7 a.m. sunrise with a ramp to full intensity at 11 a.m., full power from 11 until 4 p.m., and a ramp down to off at 8 p.m. 100% is way too much intensity, so I turned them down to 35%, which gave me that perfect amount between 75 and 120 par, which is the exact same par levels in my frag tank. This is my first time using the Reef LEDs, and my favorite thing about them so far is how evenly the par is spread throughout the entire tank. I honestly don't know how they did it, but the par readings are almost the same whether you're in the 4 corners on the bottom or at the top of the aquascape. I built a lot of tanks in this size range, and I've learned a few things about overfeeding. The trick for small systems is to stay on top of everything, especially in the first couple months. Don't overfeed. In fact, I would err on the side of underfeeding at least for the first week. Even with all of the pre-cycled media I added to the rear filtration chamber, the tank will still need time to settle into its new bioload. I only have 2 fish, and I will feed them a small amount twice a day. I'll focus more on frozen food for the first few weeks as it's a lot more nutrient dense than pellet food and therefore won't cause nutrient spikes as quickly in your tank. Over the next few weeks, I will slowly start to add in some pellet food, probably some TDO Chroma Boost, PE pellets, and Hikari Seaweed Extreme. Then for all of the livestock, but especially the copepods, I will dose 5 to 10 milliliters of Algae Barn Ocean Magic once a day. My corals then get a daily dose of amino acids, about 5 to 10 milliliters, using Red Sea AB+. I will also target feed my corals once a week with BRS Reef Chili mixed with Brightwell Aquatic's Coral Amino, and I'll do this right before a water change. That way I can turn the return pump off, target feed the corals, let it sit there for about 30 minutes so they can take in as much as possible, and then immediately do a water change so I can remove the majority of the nutrients I just added into the system. The last thing I will do is test a lot. For the first couple weeks, I'll test for ammonia every day just to make sure the cycle is complete and robust enough to handle the new bioload. Then I'll test for nitrate, phosphate, and alkalinity every 2 to 3 days and make any adjustments as needed. Likely those adjustments would be some water changes, some addition of GFO to reduce the phosphates, or some addition of Tropic Marin all for Reef to raise the alkalinity. I estimate that this tank is probably going to need 2 capfuls of all for Reef every single week to keep that alkalinity in my preferred range of 8 to 9. You may have also noticed that I didn't add any cleanup crew members yet except for the copepods. I'm going to wait for a week or 2 until some algae starts to grow, but then I'm going to add some algae-eating snails, some seraph and Nassarius snails to keep the sand bed aerated, some hermit crabs to clean up the excess food, and maybe 1 or 2 small conches. I've been staring at this tank all day while getting ready for this video, and it's pretty mesmerizing. The colors go well together. I like the shape of the aquascape. There's great movement from the Fimbriophilia, and the clown and cardinal fish make a great pairing. Even though I'm calling this the perfect beginner tank, click here to see another perfect beginner tank that I made a while back. And as always, everyone, thanks for watching. Happy reefing, be well. We'll see you next time.